How are the officers and senior NCOs trained, and how did they train their soldiers in preparation for combat in Papua New Guinea? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 102 of the Principles of War podcast, Training for Combat and Combat Leadership on the Kokoda track.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Archilochus, the Greek poet, wrote, "We don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to our level of training." He wrote this sagely advice around 650 BC, so it should come as no surprise to anyone who's looking to create a battalion and prepare it for combat that there should be a robust training program. It is the leader's responsibility to ensure that that training is conducted and that the troops are as well prepared as possible. As we look for reasons for the performance of the 53rd Battalion, we need to be looking at the leaders and the training program that they put in place. This episode is going to be looking at the training within the battalion. There is another episode coming that will look at the factors that impacted on the training program that were outside of the CO's control. COs will often say that they don't have enough resources to train their battalions. That might be time, it might be equipment, it might have expertise within the battalion. That lack of resources will be a certainty and potentially crippling when the battalion is being raised and trained during a rapid mobilisation. In that case, the CO is going to have to make do with what he's got. We're going to cover some untidy ground today because we're going to cover the actual performance of some of the officers within the battalion. And we do this not to disparage them, but what we want to do is we want to look at what training they had to perform the roles that they were given during the Battle of Isurava. Last episode, we looked at the formation of the battalion and its transport to Port Moresby. And we discussed the leadership challenges that the CO, the company commanders, the lieutenants, and the senior NCOs would have as they struggled to prepare the battalion for combat. Those challenges were that it was only 67 days from the first troops marching into the battalion before they deployed to Port Moresby. Rather than starting with a nucleus of troops from the 55th to 53rd Battalion, from which it was split off with, the 53rd Battalion was starting from scratch. 18 militia battalions were ordered to supply 62 soldiers each for the new battalion. Many of the battalions used it as an opportunity to offload soldiers that they didn't want. One of the battalions worked out who they were going to send by going through and working out who had the longest charge sheets. The 53rd Battalion was raised as a part of Darwin Force. It was going to deploy to Darwin to defend it. For many of the troops, that wasn't an overly attractive proposition, so they didn't want to go to the 53rd Battalion. Before deploying to Darwin, rather than getting the full leave entitlement that they were expecting and given the opportunity to go and see their family, they were given half a day on Christmas Day. That leave ended at 2200 on Christmas Day, and when they called the roll, they were missing 275 troops. Some of those troops came in late, many of them didn't. So to make up the difference, 104 soldiers were taken from the General Duties Depot. These were soldiers that had only just gotten their uniform. They'd been in the army less than a couple of weeks. They were marched down to the Aquitania, and once the Aquitania got out of Sydney Heads, all of the troops were told that they were going to Port Moresby, not Darwin. After they got to Port Moresby, they had 9 captains and 1 major. Now, bearing in mind that each of the companies should have a major in command, but each one of those officers was holding a temporary rank. They weren't qualified for the rank that they were holding. They had been made up because of service needs. So every one of those officers, except for Lieutenant Colonel Wood, the CO, is performing a role that they haven't been trained for. The convoy sights land at 0700 hours on the 3rd of January 1942. There are 4 factors that are going to complicate the job of the CO as he looks to prepare the battalion for war. Firstly, we've got the arrival into Port Moresby. Secondly, we've got the health issues that arise from that arrival. Then we've got enemy action. And lastly, we've got the tasks that are assigned to the battalions. All of these are going to work against the CO in the implementation of a robust training plan. It's not like Lieutenant Colonel Ward wasn't trying to train the battalion. In his first set of orders, which he issued on the 6th of January, he has written, Port Moresby garrison will be ready to resist any enemy landing from the sea or from the air at all times. All commanders will do their utmost to ensure that their units and subunits are trained and available to implement this instruction. They're not a bad set of orders, and they go through many of the things that are going to be problems. They talk about mosquitoes and malaria. They talk about dysentery. They talk about the need for camouflage and concealment from observation from the air. The War Diary on the 3rd of January talks about the 53rd Battalion personnel proceeding to the Gap, and they slept in the open. No quinine available for issue, no cooking utensils. Effectively, the battalion had none of the stores that it required to sustain itself. The problem was that the Sarpedon and the Herstein, two of the ships in the convoy with the Aquitania, had 15,000 tonnes of supplies on board. However, Port Moresby was used to only handling about 600 tonnes a day. This was compounded by the fact that much of the equipment that they needed was at the bottom of the holds. We're talking tents, we're talking mosquito netting, we're talking about kits to be able to test the water to see if it's safe to drink. How does that lack of equipment impact the battalion? By the 9th of January, there had been a large number of dysentery cases that had been evacuated to the hospital. It wasn't until the 12th of January that the unloading of the stores for the battalion had been commenced. On the 16th of January, the RSM is evacuated to the hospital with dysentery. On the 17th of January, Private A.W. Davey from Headquarters Company passes away from dysentery. This is just 14 days after they had arrived in Port Moresby. The 3rd Field Ambulance had deployed in January 1942, and B Company had set up a dysentery-specific hospital a couple of miles outside of Port Moresby. And at Napa Napa, they had an advanced dressing station that was seeing 100 patients per day. It wasn't just dysentery that was affecting the troops. Of the 7,000 troops that were stationed in Port Moresby in the first 6 months of 1942, 1,184 clinical cases of malaria were treated. Imagine that you're one of the troops who'd been taken from the General Duties Depot. 5 weeks before the first death from dysentery, you hadn't even been in the army. How do you think this will be impacting the morale of the troops? The Barry Commission released a report in 1945 on the suspension of civil administration within Papua, and it spoke specifically about the arrival of the Aquitania. The Commissioner wrote, making every allowance for the state of affairs existing in Australia at the time of the outbreak of the Japanese War, the conditions which manifested itself immediately after the arrival of this convoy calls for severe censure of the persons responsible for the loading of the troops' camp equipment. The troops were of an average age of 18 and a half and had received no proper training. They were in charge of inexperienced officers who appeared to have little or no control over them. They were inadequately equipped in every way. In particular, they were without much of the equipment necessary to give them any reasonable prospect of maintaining health in an area such as Port Moresby. In the general state of unpreparedness, that may have been inevitable, but no excuse is apparent to me for the gross carelessness and incompetence which resulted in the stowing of camp equipment at the bottom of the holds, so that when the troops were disembarked, there were no facilities to enable them to be fed and encamped. These conditions, the blame for which cannot be ascribed to the Commandant or his staff, had a grave effect upon the morale of the troops and contributed in no small measure to the disorderly and undisciplined conduct which was prevalent for some weeks after their arrival. On the 23rd of January, an air raid alarm was sounded. This turned out to be a false alarm. However, it had the effect of scaring many of the native Papuan labourers away. Some of them would return, however, it wasn't long before the Japanese conducted actual bombing raids. The first one was on the 3rd of February 1942, and that was to be the first of 100 raids on Port Moresby. The raid was conducted by 6 bombers, apparently 4-engine flying boats, from between 0300 and 0330. One person was killed during the bombing raid. At this point of the war, the RAAF had no fighters in Port Moresby, so the troops there were effectively defenceless as long as the bombers stayed above the height of the anti-aircraft guns. Much of the first month in Port Moresby was taken up with digging into defensive positions. Sometimes those positions would be shifted, which meant that the positions would need to be redug. Much of the work then transitioned to working on the wharves. Tasks were split between maintaining the defensive positions, guard duty, and working on the wharves. With the large number of troops who were in the hospital with dysentery or malaria, that meant that there wasn't a lot of time available for training. What training did the 53rd Battalion get? Some of the privates will have had a 90-day camp. Some of them, as we've seen with those that were shanghaied from the General Duties Depot, will have had no training before they got on the Aquitania headed for Moresby. They landed in Port Moresby on the 3rd of January. Hindsight's always 2020. Lieutenant Colonel Ward had until the 10th of August before he would be ordered to put one of his companies on the Kokoda track. That's 219 days. That's 7 months and 7 days before he would send troops into combat. But he doesn't know that. But by February, he would have been well and truly tracking a closer date for the likely first contact for his battalion. In fact, there were days when his troops would be at stand to, looking over the sights of their rifles, awaiting Japanese to land at Port Moresby. So his training program would have had a much greater impetus for speed, thinking that the battalion was going to be in combat a lot quicker than it was. He actually has the rare luxury of more time to prepare his troops than he was planning for. Before we look at the development and execution of his training program, I want to have a look at the doctrine that underlies the training of troops for combat. The doctrine that we're looking at came out 76 years after the Battle of Isurava. But that's okay, because what this doctrine is effectively some very flowery words that encompass the best practices that have been learnt by commanders in the preparation of troops for combat over many centuries. To underline that, I've got a couple of historic quotes. These quotes are really important because they highlight for me what the importance of training, the importance of the right kind of training, and what it is that you're trying to achieve with that training. The first quote is actually a passage from the Jewish War. This was written by Flavius Josephus. He was a Roman Jewish historian. He lived from AD 37 through to around 100. He fought in the First Jewish War as a general on the side of the Jews. He was captured by Vespasian, the Roman commander. He foretold Vespasian of a prophecy that he would become emperor. So Vespasian spared his life and he kept him on as a slave and interpreter. When he did become emperor, he set Josephus free. Josephus took on Vespasian's name, Flavius. He wrote the Jewish War in 1875. This is 18 and a half centuries before the Kokoda campaign. This was a book that was written for a Roman audience, so you would expect it to be relatively glowing and gushing about the Roman army. However, for anyone who has studied Roman history, the professionalism, the capabilities, the exploits of the Roman army, this passage will really resonate with you because it will give you insights into how all of that was achieved. Here is the passage that describes the preparation of the Roman army. And indeed, if anyone does but attend to the other parts of their military discipline, he will be forced to confess that their obtaining so large a dominion hath been the acquisition of their valour, and not the bare gift of fortune. For they do not begin to use their weapons first in time of war, nor do they then put their hands first into motion, when they have avoided so to do in times of peace. But, as if their weapons did always cling to them, they have never any truce from warlike exercises, nor do they stay till times of war admonish them to use them. For their military exercises differ not at all from the real use of their arms, but every soldier is every day exercised, and that with great diligence, as if it were in time of war, which is the reason why they bear their fatigue of battle so easily, for neither can any disorder remove them from their usual regularity, nor can fear affright them out of it, nor can labour tire them, which firmness of conduct makes them always to overcome those that have not the same firmness. Nor would he be mistaken that should call those their exercises unbloody battles, and their battles bloody exercises. There it is. There is the heart of it. They are preparing their troops psychologically. They are preparing their troops physically. and they are getting them ready to apply their doctrine when they are in combat. And from that passage comes the famous quote, that their exercises were bloodless battles and their battles bloody exercises. You train as you plan to fight, and the history of the Roman army bears that out. The other quote that I'm quite fond of is from the great Russian general Alexander Suvorov. He lived from 1730 through to 1800. He was one of Catherine the Great's generals. He commanded troops in 63 battles in which he won. He did not suffer a major defeat, which is an incredible record. He was the author of a book called The Science of Victory. Someone with a record like that you would think would know a thing or two about training troops because of the fact that they often mobilised quite rapidly. So they were bringing a lot of people into the army who may or may not have had any experience in the army before. The quote is, "Train hard, fight easy. Train easy and you will have hard fighting." Those two quotes, one from Josephus, one from Suvorov, they would have formed the underpinning of the doctrine at the start of World War II. This is what Army would have had as it was looking to prepare a battalion, many battalions, ready for war. Looking at the doctrine today, we'll start with looking at professional development. And that is described as the pursuit of professional mastery through training, education, and experience. While these three elements are integrated and complementary, each element makes a distinct contribution to the development of military professionals. Training, both individual and collective, provides the necessary suite of honed military skills. From an accurate battle shot through to conducting complex warfighting activities in a joint, combined, and interagency task force. Education provides the intellectual, conceptual, and ethical foundations to apply trained skills and to successfully adapt them to a variety of operating environments. Experience provides the opportunity to apply, practice, and refine skills and knowledge, and adapt them for future application. Together, training, education, and experience work to develop soldiers and officers who can contribute effectively to Army's capability. Thinking about the Kokoda campaign, there's a couple of things that come out of that paragraph. Firstly, interagency task force operations. Well, there was actually, because they were a part of New Guinea Force, and there was a lot of tasks that would come to the battalions that weren't your typical infantry style tasks. Developing defensive positions, definitely, particularly when you don't have engineers available. But stevedoring, is that something that you would see infantry expected to do? Unloading ships? Unlikely. The other interesting component of that is that there wasn't a lot of combined arms, and we'll do an episode where we look at why there wasn't combined arms and what the cost of that was. As we start to think about the 7 months in between them getting to Port Moresby and heading up the Kokoda track, we want to start looking for what was the training that they were getting, what was the education that they were getting, and then what experiences were they given to be able to put those two together and prepare them for combat. The doctrine goes on to state that friction, danger, uncertainty, and chance will always be present in conflict. The effects of friction can be mitigated by thorough training. The fear engendered by danger can be reduced by realistic training that generates high morale, confidence, and resilience. Education will assist in developing individuals and organisations who can act intuitively and decisively despite uncertainty. The threats and opportunities presented by chance can be better handled by individuals with the highly developed analytical skills and creativity promoted by education. Therefore, training and education are central to Army's ability to generate force capable of employing land power across the modern spectrum of peace, crisis, and war. Soldiers will initially train in the key soldier skills such as first aid, mastery of their weapon, navigation. They'll then look to do collective training. So they'll train to work together as a section. That section will then become part of a platoon, that platoon part of a company, and the company part of the battalion. Realistic training at the platoon level will give them high morale, confidence that they're going to be able to do their job, and the resilience that they require once they're in contact. We see this as being a key feature that is missing in the 53rd Battalion's platoons. When that initial shock of combat comes, many of them aren't resilient. They don't have the morale to enable them to stand and fight, and they don't have the confidence in their weapons and their sections and their platoons to enable them to be resilient. Drilling a little bit further into training, education, and experience, we have definitions for each of them. Training is the planned process to inculcate and modify skills, knowledge, and attitudes through learning experience in order to achieve effective performance in an activity or range of activities. Training incorporates the introduction of skills, knowledge, and attitudes through instruction, and their development and maintenance of proficiency through practice. Training enables individual soldiers to carry out their assigned roles through the spectrum of military activity and enables groups of soldiers to work collectively towards a military objective. Training ensures that personnel can apply standard solutions to predictable circumstances, that is, they can deal with a familiar problem in a familiar context. What kind of problems would the doctrine be talking about? I've got a very simple example. Simple but tragic in the consequences that it has. This is an excerpt from the interview with Captain Trevor King. He's the OC of one of the companies, and he is talking about a contact that occurred on the same day that Lieutenant Colonel Ward was killed.
The morale of the men was very low when they found that their equipment wasn't equal to the Japanese, and we were issued with Bren guns. And whilst odd people had a preliminary training on Bren gun, the general soldier didn't know how to work it. I remember on one occasion one of our sergeants hanging onto a Bren gun, firing into an area where it was clearly known there were Japs, and when the magazine ran out, he said, "How in the b-hell do you change this magazine?" And within the next few moments, a Japanese sniper ended the story.
What was his name?
Bullocky Spaulding. I can't remember his first Christian name, but Spaulding was his name, an excellent man and a very brave soldier.
Trevor says in the interview there that it's a sergeant. It's actually Warrant Officer Class 2 Warry Spaulding. Now, I believe that wasn't his Bren gun. I think he'd actually picked a Bren gun up from someone who'd been hit and he was returning fire with it. But what was the task that he hadn't been trained to do? It is one of the most fundamental tasks. It is the changing an empty magazine on the Bren gun. He's the company sergeant major of the company, so he shouldn't really be having to worry about a Bren gun, apart from the fact that it is his job to make sure that everyone is able to use the Bren gun. He would have assisted the OC in developing the training program, making sure that everyone was very familiar with the Bren gun. You're going to be changing a magazine when you're in contact, when you're in information overload, when you're scared for your life. You want to be able to do a mag change reflexively, without thinking, without even looking, because you might be doing it in the middle of the night and can't see anything. We do know that some of the platoons were issued their Brens before they went up the Kokoda track. However, we do know that many of the troops received their Bren guns as they were passing through Owa's Corner, heading up to Isurava. They received what is known as a Soldier's 5, the 5-minute lesson that will tell you everything that you need to know about a subject. But when it comes to a weapon, a Soldier's 5 doesn't cut it. It needs to be a lesson, a series of lessons, reinforced by practice, reinforced by repetition, so that it becomes second nature. If the CSM didn't know how to do a mag change on a Bren, then how many soldiers in the company, in the battalion, didn't know how to do a mag change on a Bren? What does that say about their confidence? What does it say about their morale? So we've picked up on a significant training shortfall, and if you can't do a mag change on a Bren, there's probably a lot of other things that you can't do. Why that's the case, we'll need to look a little bit further. Next in the doctrine is education. So in the Army's context, education is intellectual, moral and social instruction in the profession of arms. It provides individuals with the intellectual skills, knowledge and attitude needed to undertake military tasks. Education broadens individuals' horizons, allowing training to be assimilated more quickly and with greater understanding. Education helps develop and foster military professionals who can think, apply knowledge, solve problems under uncertain or ambiguous conditions, and communicate their decisions. Through education, soldiers can find reasoned and viable solutions to complicated and unanticipated situations. That is, they can adapt to deal with complex problems in unfamiliar contexts, often while under stress or in dangerous situations. At the most basic level, Warrant Officer Spalding should have received a lesson on how the Bren gun fires. I'm pretty sure he didn't receive that. The last component for our triad of professional development is experience. And the doctrine says that experience is knowledge or practical wisdom gained from what one has observed, encountered, or undergone. An individual gains direct experience by actively participating in an activity. An individual gains indirect experience by observing events while not being a participant. Experience is important in the development of military professionals as it provides context for the skills and knowledge gained through training and provides time for individual reflection, refinement, and adaptation. Organisational experience is concerned with maximising the benefit that the organisation can gain from individual experience. It ensures that lessons are captured, distributed, and reinforced. There's two things that come out of the experiential part of professional development. The first thing is, what are the kind of experiences that the 53rd Battalion would have benefited from? And the second thing is those first couple of times in combat. How did that occur for the 53rd Battalion? Firstly, the kind of experiences that they needed, well, they could have done with some time at the range, but we know that there was very little time for the soldiers to become familiar with their weapons at the range. There wasn't the time and there wasn't the ammunition for it. They could have gone and done some navigation exercises. They could have done some patrolling up the Kokoda track just to get a feel for what it's like to be in the jungle. What is it like to maneuver in the jungle? All of these things were sadly lacking. So the second part is that experience with the first couple of contacts that a company or battalion has. And I think there's a really interesting comparison between the 39th Battalion and the 53rd Battalion. The initial contacts for the 39th Battalion happened a long way forward. They were out of communications with New Guinea Force or Brigade Headquarters. So the reports of how well that contact went never really got back to them without being moderated. For the 53rd Battalion, some of those stories were being brought back by panicked corporals or privates, and they're actually going through brigade headquarters before they get to battalion headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Ward has got no opportunity to take the story in, to try and make sense of it, and then report it up. It is coming from that corporal, from that private. And so the impression that the 53rd Battalion is not going as well as it could do starts with these initial stories of those first contacts. The battalion has their first contact on the 21st of August. The CO is killed on the 27th of August. And it's on the 30th of August that the withdrawal to Eora Creek is commenced. Remember, the companies are operating in quite a spread out area, so there's not a lot of communication between the companies. So there's no opportunity for lessons learnt to come between the companies. Those 9 days does not give a lot of time for reflection, lessons learnt, and critically, refinement of skills and drills to enable adaptation to the Japanese tactics. So why wasn't the training occurring? One of the many reasons, was that there wasn't enough time. I'm not talking about the time between them getting to Port Moresby and contact with the Japanese, because they had 7 months before they started out up the Kokoda track. No, I'm talking about the number of hours in the day versus the number of tasks that they were given. David Cameron, in his book, The Battle of Isurava, quotes the battalion war diary to give you an idea of what an average day was like for the soldiers within the battalion. This is the 6th of May 1942. 5 officers, 120 other ranks, unloading boat from 0 to 100 hours to 1000 hours. CO on recce. B Company, area inspecting beach wiring. Instruction received from Brigade for Delta Company to return to unit from Defence, Bomber Drome. Carrier platoon to take over paratroop defence of Bomber and Laloki dromes. I'm going to end this episode with the words of Lieutenant Ron Plater. Now, he is a graduate of the Royal Military College, Duntroon. He has been trained to be a platoon commander. Upon graduation from RMC, he is posted to New Guinea Force Headquarters as a staff officer. However, like all good lieutenants, he wants to be a platoon commander. I'll let him tell you the story of what the training program was like within his platoon in the 53rd Battalion.
I reported to the brigade, and foolishly said I'd wanted a platoon, and I finished up with this terrible platoon. Nice guys, but knew nothing at all about soldiering. And Unfortunately, there was very little time for them to train. It was a shocking situation there because they're all militia troops. There were no AAF there at all, virtually at that stage, except a few officers. And these boys are supposed to learn, do a bit of military training, and also unload ships. So night after night, we would be going unloading ships, and then what time we could find during the day, we'd try and train them. We eventually got some Bren guns, and another officer and I, who knew a bit about Bren guns, had to try and train the whole of the 53rd Battalion in the use of Bren guns in spare time, really, in between unloading ships.
Lieutenant Plater explains how he starts to work with his new platoon, his first platoon.
I didn't know a thing about them. I just was told to report to the battalion, which I did, and I was allotted a platoon. I had to try and find out their names, first of all, and what they knew. And they didn't know much. And I had to see who the NCOs and what they knew, which is just about a tiny little bit more. And a camp quite near the airport, if I remember correctly, and so we're pretty close to being bombed most nights or days. And because the Japanese by that time were bombing pretty thoroughly there, they'd already sunk the McJerry and other ships in the harbour. Then, despite the bombing, we had to go and unload the ships, or help unload the ships. I don't remember seeing anything of any senior officers near us at any time. I dare say the brigadier came around, but anyone else above that, I don't think there was anything like it. The men were sort of revolutionary, you know. Their attitude was, what are they doing to us, you know? And just try and say that, you know, we're going to try and help you to become proper soldiers. But unfortunately, most of our time got to spend unloading supplies.
So really not enough time for much training at all for the battalion. Their primary focus was on developing the defensive works for Port Moresby. After that, it was stevedoring, road building, and other works around the city. In the next episode, we'll look at the principles of training, and we'll look at some of the other factors that denied the battalion the opportunity to be the combat force that it could have been at the Battle of Isurava. If you're getting something out of the podcast, or if you're finding it useful for your professional military education, then please spread the word. Word of mouth is one of the best ways that we can spread the message of the value that the Principles of War podcast is creating. Very exciting to see the downloads now north of 750,000 as we punch on towards 1 million downloads. Thank you, everyone, for the support, particularly those who help out with the research, coming up with all sorts of interesting parts of the story so that we can get a better understanding of the battles that we're looking at and the lessons that we need to learn.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.